Steve Albini was one of my all-time favorite musicians, but on top of that he was probably my single favorite recording engineer. He did so many masterpieces, both with his own bands and as others. And I've listened to dozens and dozens of interviews and talks that he gives because he was one of the most insightful and articulated person that ever existed. Super intelligent, but also very humble. I mean, he was a loudmouth back in the day. He came out a few years ago on Twitter and took responsibility for things he said. I mean, nothing too horrible. He did front a band called Rapeman. The point is, he evolved with the times. He was always outspoken how he felt about the current state of the country, political and sociologically, but also the state of the music business, or lack thereof, in recent years. I feel so unbelievably lucky to have had that chat with Steve. I had been in contact with him through email since mid-January this year, 2024, and we were trying to sort out time. He was kind of ignoring me for about a month. Then he finally came back to me on February 16th, and on Monday the 20th we sat down and had this hour and a half long conversation. Probably one of the last things he ever did. Please send me a link on alvarpeelingonion@gmail if you have a later interview, but this is definitely one of the latest talks he did. It was really funny because he was a little standoffish at first, but then when he realized I wasn't just some dweeb asking about Nirvana, he kind of eased up and became warm and funny and as always insightful. But he's definitely irreplaceable, both as a person, as a musical and recording artist. So, like, I mean, no words can do the man justice. So go out and listen to Big Black and Shellac and all of these albums he did and listen to his talks. Thanks. All right, Mr. Steve Albini. How are you doing, sir?
You know, the world is a troubling place. I'm getting old, and we're still in a global pandemic. So those things aside, everything is great.
Right. Yeah, I can imagine that the pandemic put a big dent in your business, right?
Yeah, but in a kind of a strange way. The biggest impact it had was that international travel basically stopped for a couple of years, and that was a big part of our clientele. And then in the intervening couple of years, there have been a bunch of immigration restrictions put in place, first by Trump and then by Biden, that make it more difficult for people to come to America to make records. So those two things have really impacted our international business, which was a big part of my work. So that's probably the biggest impact that the pandemic had, was that it was like the start of the kind of a shutdown of international travel for music.
So the demographic now, it's mainly American, or?
Yeah, we are. I mean, looking at my schedule, I do still have some foreign clients coming between now and the end of summer. We have bands from Europe and Japan coming, but in a typical year, it would be about 30% of my business would be international work, and now it's probably down to 10 or 15%.
Okay, I see. Right. So what about the new Shellac album? The last time I heard, you guys were waiting for a clean test pressing. Anything new with that?
Yeah, we finally got clean test pressings. We approved everything, and now it's just in manufacture. So should be relatively soon. I don't know what the schedule of these things is. We don't work to a scheduled release date. We just get the records ready and then start selling them when we have them. So it shouldn't be too long. I would assume less than a month, but
You could wait for September 16th to make it a whole decade between that one and
yeah.
Dude Incredible.
Yeah, I never people get hung up about release dates for some reason. I genuinely don't know or care what date any of my favorite records were released, and I don't think people in general care when records are released. I don't think those things matter in the slightest, and it's never bothered me that if something comes out later or earlier than someone anticipated, that shit just never mattered to me at all.
Sure. So is there a plan to tour the album extensively?
No, I mean our touring and our record releases have always been unrelated to each other. We tour when there are shows that we can do that are worth doing, and we put a record out when we have music worth recording. They're not related to each other, and I suspect that we'll get asked to do more shows with a new album coming out. That'll probably get some people's attention, and we'll be asked to do more shows, which is nice, but it's not really a pattern for us. It's not really how we organize our lives.
Right. So you often talked about that it was a watershed moment for you hearing the Ramones.
Yeah.
You weren't really an avid music listener before that, were you?
Yeah. I wasn't really interested in music per se until I was a teenager.
So were there any other artists or albums that cemented your interest in music?
Very important bands for me early on were the Stooges. The Ramones definitely. Television, Peru, Public Image, Public Image Limited. Hang tight 1 second.
Sure.
Hello. Okay, come on up to the second floor. You'll have to bear with me. I have to deal with this. It'll be just a moment.
Sure, no problem.
There's a guy coming up with some tapes for to be transferred.
Steve's getting some tapes to transfer?
Sorry about that. Carry on.
Sure, no problem. You moved to Missoula, Montana when you were 12 years old. I can imagine many bands making their way up there to play, or how was that?
Well, you didn't see a lot of contemporary punk or underground bands, but there was always music from the local music scene, and Missoula was a university town, so the kinds of things that always go on with associated with a college. There's always quite a bit of nightlife associated with a college. So
okay. So were there any formative concert experiences you had in Missoula when you were a teenager?
No, not really. I mean, I would go see bands, but the bigger touring bands that I saw were all like very mainstream bands. Like I saw, Jethro Tull and well, actually, there was one really great concert that I saw there. I got to see Willie Nelson with his touring band at a time when they were really at peak power. That was really fantastic band at that time. And
what year do you reckon that was?
Would have been about 1977 or 78.
Very nice.
And that was a terrific show. That may be the best show that I saw during the time I was there.
Okay. So it was a crucial decision for you to go to Evanston, Illinois for college at Northwestern, because it put you in the middle of the... Was there already a thriving punk scene in Chicago at the time?
It was just getting underway. The punk scene in Chicago was just getting underway at that point. But it was fantastic. I mean, I got very, very lucky coming here because the music scene here was, full of very smart, very interesting people, and the in a lot of places the music scene was kind of an imitation of something from elsewhere, like an imitation of Los Angeles or an imitation of New York or something like that. And that really wasn't the case here. The music scene here really had a distinct identity, and so I got quite lucky. And a lot of the bands that were beginning to be active here then ended up being extremely influential on me and a bunch of my peers around the same time.
Right. So that distinctive identity, was it just because there was a really good batch of people at that time and place?
Yeah, I don't know that there was anything special about the social or political environment here. I guess one thing that mattered a lot was there was a really close symbiosis between the gay subculture and the punk subculture here. So there was already a kind of an underground network of venues and shops and stuff like that was kind of tied to the gay underground, and it got very quickly kind of co-opted by the punk underground. So like there was a gay couple that ran the sort of the best record shop in town, a record shop called Wax Trax, which became a record label eventually, and was very important for a lot of the sort of industrial and club music that came out of here. But before that, before the label was a really big presence, Jim and Danny, those two guys were really instrumental in getting touring bands to come to Chicago and finding places for them to play and making sure their records were in stock, and so they were really, really important to the scene. And I guess probably everywhere where there's like where there was a really vibrant scene, you can point to two or three people as being really important instigators. And definitely Wax Trax was the center of attention, and definitely Jim and Danny were like the two people who got the ball rolling,
When you started doing music on your own, like writing music, was that just the first Big Black songs, or had you been writing music with other people prior to that?
I had been in other bands, garage bands, since I was a teenager, and we always wrote songs, none of them of any consequence. But the sort of instigating factor for me to get started with Big Black was that I had been in a band in Chicago called Stations. I was the bass player in that band, and then they kicked me out of the band because that band had some sort of arty aspirations, and I was much more of like a sort of a street level punk at that point. And so I would make fun of their arty aspirations, and that got irritating after a while, and they kicked me out of the band. And then I had time on my hands, and I had gotten back into the swing of playing from being in this band, and I enjoyed it, so I wanted to keep going. And so Big Black sort of grew out of that, the period immediately after that, where I had time on my hands and started working on my own material.
And did you pick up the guitar just prior to that, or?
I played bass primarily, but then I started playing guitar, sort of just as an outgrowth of wanting to have guitar on these songs that I was working on. And I wasn't a skilled guitarist by any means, but I could, I could do things that satisfied me. And that, I mean, that's sort of the development of my style as a guitar player, is that I've never really paid that much attention to what other guitar players do. I just do things that amuse me on the guitar.
Right.
So,
Were you already using metal picks on the Lungs EP?
I don't remember when that started. The critical thing about the metal picks is that they have a little notch cut in the end of them, so that there are 2 points on the end of the guitar pick, so that when you hit the string, you're hitting it twice. And I know that I had been doing that with plastic guitar picks, but that also caused them to break. When you cut a little notch in the end, that makes a weak point, and then they break easier. So when I found these metal guitar picks, it seemed like, hey, I can cut a notch in there, and then the metal is going to be durable enough that they won't break. And that's why I ended up using metal guitar picks, was just because I wanted to have this gimmick of using the notch in the end of the pick.
Right.
And metal picks were just more durable, that's all.
So have you always played in standard tuning on the guitar?
In Big Black, it was pretty much always standard tuning. And then since then, I go back and forth between standard and drop D for some stuff. But drop D and standard tuning are usually that's about as weird as I get with my guitar tuning.
Oh, okay. So I heard you started using a drum machine because it could play fast and steady without getting tired and would follow commands. Exactly. Were there any other reasons, like any bands that you liked that utilized the drum machine?
Yeah, there was a kind of a tradition at the time, not a tradition really, but like a little movement of bands that were sort of implementing electronic sound and punk. Bands like Metal or Bane and Cabaret Voltaire and Suicide and Tuxedo Moon and a few other bands that where there was a synthesized or mechanical element, but then also the kind of aggressive or experimental edge that you would get from more conventional guitar bands. And that was a really, all of that stuff was a big influence on me, especially the French band Metal or Bane. They were like the nearest thing to what I wanted to do in my band, which was to have, there was a band in Chicago called Breaking Circus, which formed out of there was a punk band called Strike Under. And when that band broke up, the singer and the guitar player singer in that band formed a duo with a drum machine. And they were sort of contemporaries of Big Black, doing stuff that wasn't that different from what Big Black was doing. And all of that stuff influenced me, and all of that stuff, was like part of my help to form my identity as a musician.
It must have been exhilarating to get Jeff Passari and Santiago Durango to play with you in Big Black.
Yeah, it was unexpected when Jeff agreed to play in the band. I mean, he actually sort of suggested it, which was odd. Like, I ran into him at a show and he said, "Oh, hey, I heard that Big Black thing you did. That was pretty cool. If you want to put a band together sometime to play those songs, I'd be happy to help out." And I was like, "Oh, fucking great," And then getting Santiago into the band as well was really just, I mean, that's like having an all-star team. I I felt incredibly lucky that those guys wanted to be a part of the band that I was putting together. And then we also got along really well, and we played well together, and everything about it was a really nice synthesis of their personalities and the ideas that we were sort of communally working up in the band. The first Big Black record is the weakest of them because I'm responsible for all of the ideas, and then as soon as it became a functioning band and there was a more conversational aspect to the songwriting part, there were more people contributing to forming the music. Everything just got instantly better.
Right. How was the writing process? Did you outline it, or did you guys jam it out?
A lot of it was sort of like I would come up with a sort of a fundamental idea, and then as a band we would play with it, and it would come together and become a complete song in that way. But it wasn't like I wrote a song and I told people what to play and this is how it went. It wasn't like that at all.
What about the lyric writing?
Same. Like a lot of the ideas were just purely mine, but then also Santiago and Jeff would contribute ideas. Santiago, there were a few songs that he had written for other projects earlier in his life, and some of those were adapted to Big Black.
So did the chemistry in the band change considerably after Dave Riley replaced Jeff Passari?
Yeah. Dave was a more gifted musician, sort of generally, but also he had a stronger personality. Like he was more. Jeff basically just wanted to participate without having to be responsible for too much, and Dave was happy to be like a sort of an active part of the songwriting and stuff.
Right. So was Ian Burgess really active in shaping the sounds of these first EPs and Atomizer?
I wouldn't say he was important in shaping the sound, but he was very important to me. Like his friendship and his sort of mentorship was very important to me. Like he when I was learning to become a recording engineer, he very directly helped me understand recording concepts and gave me some very important ideas. Hold the line a moment. I just need to answer this. Hello. All right, please leave it inside. Come on in. Yeah, Ian was very much a friend to all of the bands in the scene in the 80s. He went out of his way to make himself available as an engineer, and the studios that he worked at were generally more commercial studios. Like most of their clientele was radio jingles and TV commercials and soundtrack stuff and that kind of thing. So getting all the rock bands involved in that on a I don't know how to describe it, sort of clandestine basis. Like he would find off hours at those studios and invite the bands to come in and record, but that was always at a time when the studio wasn't being booked otherwise. It was a big help to the bands in town for him to make that studios of that caliber available. So a lot of bands got to make nicely professional recordings that they wouldn't have been able to afford under any other means,
Mm-hmm.
And he was also just a really gregarious guy. Like whenever he would go see a band, he would always make a point of hanging out with them afterwards and drinking with them. And he was always, sort of socially involved with the bands that he was working with. he really felt like he was a fixture in the scene, and like he made the bands feel like he was their biggest fan. When he was working with the band, he would make it seem like, like he couldn't wait for the next thing that you were going to do because he was so excited about it.
Okay.
Like I don't have anything like that kind of bedside manner. Like I can't even fake that. For him, it was just, he was like a puppy dog. He just really loved being around those people. He was really invigorated by the music and by the scene, and it comprised most of his social life as well.
So that's the feeling you got with him when you were working on this Big Black stuff.
Yeah, he was a real cheerleader for the band. He really, whatever crazy ideas we had, he was happy to implement them. Like there was a studio that was going under. There was a studio that was built into a big old, a former auto dealership, so it was the building had previously been a showroom for automobiles, so it was quite large. And so there was a big auditorium, like sort of mock auditorium built into this studio that had a PA system and everything. And that was intended to be used for sort of showcases for bands to perform in front of record labels and that kind of thing. But as this studio started to go under, it never got really used for that purpose, but the whole PA system was still sitting there wired up. So what we did was we turned it into a big reverb chamber, and we would send the drum machine into this big PA and record it at a distance. And that added a lot of the ambient sound that you hear on the Big Black records during that period. On the Racer X record, for example, was recorded in that studio. And the owner of that studio had a terrible drug problem. And he told Ian that the studio was about to get closed because of all the money that he owed. They were about to foreclose on all of his loans, and then he'd lose the building. But before that happened, if he wanted to get some bands in there to do recording, if we could get him $100 in cash, he would let us have the studio for a day.
Okay.
And $100 is a convenient drug dealer increment.
Sure.
And cash, of course, because they don't take credit cards. So during the last couple of weeks of the existence of that studio, Ian basically lived there, and he was there around the clock making records with every band in Chicago. Like every band in Chicago took advantage of this deal, like $100, you get, pay Ian, pay $100, and you get this fancy studio. And there were probably a dozen records made during that last 2 weeks of that studio's existence.
Nice. Did that influence you to record bands at a good bargain and, being easy to find then?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, everything about my practices was kind of formed by being in one of these broke-ass independent bands during that period. Like, instead of hiring somebody to do something for you, you figure out how to do it yourself, and that way you don't have to pay anybody. Instead of having a service take care of some of your responsibility, you figure out what that service would be doing, and then you do it so that you don't have to pay for it. That was a big part of my identity then, and it still is. At Electrical Audio, we try to do everything that we can in-house. We try to, when we were building the studio, we also built all the furniture that we have in the studio. A guy that worked here designed and built all the furniture that we use, because it was a lot less expensive than buying furniture. When we have we have an in-house maintenance staff for our equipment and microphones and stuff. And the reason that we do is that it's less expensive to have someone on staff taking care of that stuff than hiring somebody else at an exorbitant price to come and fix things. And it just improves the general standard of things if everything is kept close and everything is done in-house. So, and that, and all of that is an outgrowth of the sort of punk underground, where you try to get the maximum impact for the minimum money.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at the calculator on the Electrical Audio Studio website where you can estimate the cost of a session. And I was drawing a parallel because when you did in Utero, you did that in 14 days, but the basic tracks were like 3 or 4 days, and then Kurt basically recorded all of his vocals in an 8-10 hour session. So I put 7 days in Studio B with you engineering, with 40 minutes of tape. That was around $10,000, which is about the same you would get from a professional studio here in Iceland, but that would only be a digital session. And I mean, and the engineer wouldn't be you, obviously,
Yeah, I mean, I don't I feel like I'm well paid for the time that I spend on records that I work on. Like, I don't feel like I need special treatment or extra money, I just want to make sure that the studio as a whole is earning enough money from my sessions that we can keep the lights on. The studio itself is going out at an embarrassingly low rate. Like, the rate for renting the studio empty, to me, seems absurd, because it's less than I was having to spend to rent studios in the 1980s.
Okay.
This studio is much nicer than any of the studios that I was able to rent in the 1980s, So I do feel like there's a disconnect in the value of the components. Like, me working on the session, sure, it's worth something, but it's not worth more than the whole studio. That's ultimately the pricing is what we can convince other people to pay, and not what I think intuitively that things should be worth,
Okay, so it's not just like a public service,
I mean, if we could charge more and get people to pay it, we would charge more. I want to pay my employees well. I want to have the studio. I want to be able to improve the studio, and all of that requires money. So it's incumbent on me to try to earn as much money as I possibly can. I do have a lot of sympathy for the bands, and I want them to have a good experience at a reasonable price and everything. But when I remember spending $800 or $900 per day on an empty studio in the 1980s. And then when I look at our prices now and I realize that we're charging less than that, I do feel slightly foolish. But I also know that in the 1980s, you couldn't just make a record at home on your laptop because there were no laptops. And now people can make a record at home on their laptop for free. And we're not competing with other studios who have studio prices. We're competing with free. We're competing with people who are like, just, convincing someone to use a studio at all is a kind of a big effort now, just because the home recording stuff is so capable. You really do need a good reason to want to come into a proper studio and do things in the traditional ways.
Right. But there are very few like professional studios left that use analog equipment as the regular protocol for recording, right?
Yeah, I mean, there aren't as many as there used to be, but there are still studios that function as analog studios. Yeah. Off the top of my head, I can think of a half dozen in North America and a half dozen in Europe where I would be comfortable making a record in my normal methods using analog tape from beginning to end.
You use it solely because it's the best way to, preserve the recordings, right?
I mean, the principal reason that I do things in the analog, that I persist in the analog methods, is that I think it's a very good way to make music, a very good way to make recordings. The most important aspect of it is that the final recording will survive for a very long time. And I don't have any confidence in any of the digital formats that they will be retrievable in the distant future. And when I say distant future, I don't just mean, every 10 years or so, the computer industry changes to the extent that people have trouble resurrecting old files and old formats. But I'm talking about, 50 years or 100 years. And I just don't have any confidence in any of the digital formats being retrievable on that kind of time scale. Whereas I know with certainty that all the analog formats will be fine. And I feel a pretty big responsibility to my clients to make their music recordings durable and make the recordings that I do for them more than just a temporary pleasure.
I mean, I do agree with you. It does make sense that you would want to preserve your recording for as long a time as possible, but you still seem to be in a minority.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I'm not an evangelist about this either. Like, I have an opinion about this stuff, and I have working methods that I use, but I'm not going to try to shame other people for not doing it that way. And I'm not going to try to convince people who have convinced themselves that these issues are not important. All right, well, you've made up your mind, and I'm not, there's no value in me trying to talk somebody out of something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I remember a really interesting story where they weren't allowed to import a tape machine into Soviet Russia, so they just built one from scratch.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. I actually met an accordion player who had worked at that studio and knew the people that built the tape machine.
Okay.
Yeah, he was here working on a session with it was a recent Russian immigrant, and he was working on a session that had this sort of klezmer style or Jewish Russian style accordion, and we were talking about the different studio experiences in Russia and in America, and he described this studio that he worked at in Leningrad, I believe, and no, in Petersburg. And we were talking about it. I said, "Oh yeah, I heard about this guy that built a tape machine." Is yeah, that's the one. He built a tape machine in a garage.
I mean, I always remember your quote where you said that in a distant Mad Max future, you could always build a tape machine and resurrect these sessions.
Yeah, I mean, a tape machine, if you just wanted to build some simple playback system for magnetic tapes, they're no more complicated than a washing machine. There's a motor, the speed control, and that's about it. Like, you can get by with that much. And the early tape machines, like the early tape machines that were used professionally, are extremely simple machines. All of the components are available generically. You can keep those machines running for decades. Like, the oldest machines that we have in our studio are still operating as though they were brand new. Like, they still operate perfectly, just with normal, regular maintenance and occasional repairs. And the oldest of these machines are from the early 1980s. So every day I'm using machines that are 45 years old, and they're fine. They operate like they're brand new machines.
So what do you need to do to maintain them?
Greg Norman, who's our chief technical engineer, you keep him aware of any problems that come up with the machine, with any of the machines, and then he works on those problems and solves them. And he has a very complete diary of all the repair and maintenance that he's done on everything in the building. And by referring to that diary and the original technical manuals that came with the equipment, he can diagnose the problems. And they're, like I said, they're relatively simple machines. Honestly, there isn't that much black magic in the tape machines. So keeping them working perfectly, while it does require some attention and some money, it doesn't require that much attention or that much money. It's less problematic than if you have an old car. because the parts in a car wear out because they do much more physical labor. The parts in the tape machine, they're moving parts, but they're not like having to, they're not grinding they're not having to carry a heavy load. So as long as you keep things in alignment and you keep everything working at, in its normal parameters, these machines could easily run for 100 years.
Right. And you do a lot of tape transfers and tape restoration.
Yeah, I think every studio that has good analog playback is getting some of this business now, but we do get it a lot. We have a pretty good reputation in the transfer and duplication and work making archive copies and things like that. It's becoming a bigger part of our business, and we're actually building a special studio that we're going to dedicate to transfer and restoration work.
Yeah, and you don't have a problem restoring these old tapes.
No, I mean, that's the beautiful thing about analog recordings is there are some little problems with the tapes and storage, like they can become sticky from absorbing water out of the atmosphere, or the lubricants can break down and they have a kind of a shiny surface. But all of these are solvable problems. Like you can dehydrate the tapes and then they're not sticky anymore. You can clean the surface and then they're not slimy anymore. Like they're solvable problems. There's nothing about these problems that makes them unplayable.
Right. And it's a myth that they easily degrade.
Yeah, magnetic recordings are incredibly durable. It's very, very difficult to destroy a magnetic recording. You either need to have an electromagnet that can yank it out of your hands, something that powerful, or you need to burn them in a fire. Like basically anything else, they can survive.
Okay. I was wondering, because you made Lungs in 81, and then you recorded Server Rosa in 1987.
Yeah.
And there are like 5-6 years between those albums, but only about like 5 to 10 albums that you made in the meantime, at least according to Wikipedia. Would you say that's an accurate assessment?
Well, the Wikipedia I was working all the time. I was making several records a month during that whole period.
Oh, okay. I see.
It's like anything else. The experience, the more experience you have with something, the better you get at it. And also I had access to better equipment. The Lungs record and some of my early demos for other bands were recorded on a 4-track machine with 1 or 2 microphones, and then after I built a home studio, I bought a house in 1985 or 86, and I built a home studio in there, and that improved everything improved. The quality of everything improved when I had a dedicated studio that I could work in. And then that studio was later expanded into a 24-track studio from an 8-track studio. And I got a bigger console and better tape machines, and everything kept improving over time.
Right.
Yeah, everything is about experience and investment,
Mm-hmm. So you didn't record Server Rosa at your studio. You recorded it, in Boston, right?
Yeah, Server Rosa was recorded at a studio called Q Division in Boston. That studio survived, and it's still functioning, but it's in a different location. It's in a different building.
So you had a conversation with the Pixies before you recorded the album, like how they wanted it to sound.
Yeah, we had a conversation. That is sort of my normal practice, is to have a conversation with the band and find out what things they like and don't like. But also it was a very experimental period for me. And so there were some experiments taken on that record as well.
Right. So I was wondering about Rapeman. When you formed that band, were you already looking for the change in rhythm? Because Big Black almost exclusively used a drum machine. So there's a stark change between that straightforward drumming and the stop and start feel of the Rapeman.
Yeah, I didn't have a real conceptual idea for Rapeman until we started playing together, and there became a kind of a band identity after we started playing together. I loved Ray Reynolds Washam. His drumming was just really athletic and really, really precise and really athletic. And I thought David Sims's bass playing was really powerful and menacing. And I just wanted to be in a band with these two people that I respected. And after we started playing together, the band formed an identity, but we didn't have any founding principles. Like, we didn't start out saying, yeah, we want to use some funny time signatures, we want to use some jazz chords or whatever. Like, all of the personality of that band developed through the process of writing the music. And the name of the band is inexcusable, but I'm proud of the music that we made, and I was happy playing that music. I felt very satisfied, developing and playing that music. I felt like it was a big step forward from Big Black, which was quite minimal. And then that band, because we didn't really have any personal chemistry before we started playing together, I think that's the reason that we couldn't survive as a band. Just we were existing purely for the sake of making this music, but on a personal level, we didn't really like each other as well as we liked the music, and I'm friends with those guys still, and I admire them tremendously. But it seems now like it was a mistake to try to force that band together. It was almost like an arranged marriage, where you have these players that like and respect each other, and then you just, jam them in a room and hope that something good happens.
I mean, that group, although unfortunately named, is definitely responsible for the most radio-friendly Albini tune. The CC Top cover, Just Got Paid. Definitely the most feel-good Albini track.
Yeah, that was the other two guys in the band were from Texas, and ZZ Top were revered in Texas. I didn't take them that seriously. The band ZZ Top didn't really mean anything to me until those guys exposed me to their whole catalog, and I'm now an enormous fan of ZZ Top.
Did you engineer the LP, Two Nuns and a Pack Mule?
Some of the recording I did, and some of the recording was done by a friend of theirs from Texas that they had worked with previously that they liked, a guy named Kerry Crafton. And I thought he was a great engineer, and I thought he did a great job. Yeah, but I would say maybe half the record was done by me and half the record was done by him.
Is the band not on Tidal and streaming services just because of the name?
No, I mean, I removed all the music that I'm responsible for. I removed from Spotify because I don't like Spotify as a business. I think they're a terrible business, and I don't want to be a part of their business.
Sure.
But the other streaming services, either they didn't want, some of them, it should be available in some places, but I don't know precisely where. And you can still buy the records in the store. So,
I mean, in later years, you've expressed regret for the name, and that's cool. But did you know that meanwhile, in Japan, Rapeman got 9 live-action film releases?
Yeah, I had heard about that. I haven't seen any of them, but I had heard about that at the time. Yeah,
that's insane.
And I'll point out that what appealed to us about the band, naming the band Rapeman, was how impossible it seemed that such a thing could exist. A superhero whose superpower was raping people just seemed impossible and incomprehensible to us, but it seemed mundane and normal to the Japanese people where we encountered it. And that juxtaposition, the sort of shocking aspect of it in one context, but then the sort of benign normalcy of it in another context, that was the duality of meaning that seemed intriguing to us. Bear with me one moment. Hello. All right, please bring it inside. Come on in. Sorry about that. And now, of course, with even a moment's consideration, it seems absurd and unforgivable. And at the time, I think there was a movement in the music underground to soften or make music that was more commercially acceptable and more and like prettier and nicer than our punk rock origins. Like a lot of people of our age were retreating into a kind of a normal mode, like where, oh yeah, we made that crazy music when we were young, but now we're going to do something that's got, you know, real class. And and that kind of revanchist thing or revisionary thinking really rankled us. It made us, in that band, it made us feel like that was a coward's approach to music, was to abandon your edge and try to make things that made people happy and satisfied expectations. So we reacted against that by trying to find the ugliest, most unpalatable name for a band and try to make the music that was the most difficult to accept for in order to distinguish ourselves from the people who were trying to get on MTV and trying to become pop stars. Like that approach toward a career seemed stupid and insulting to us, and we wanted to make as much distance between ourselves and that kind of thinking as possible. And choosing a horrible band name seemed like a valid tool in that respect. And so that's, I'm not saying that by way of excusing the name. I'm saying that by way of explaining the thinking that brought us to that point.
I mean, it's definitely a little bit funny that while people were protesting outside your concerts, they had like 13 volumes of this manga series released and, you know, 9 live action films, including 6 sequels and 2 spin-off films, you know?
Yeah. And I have to say that I'm in general terms, I was sympathetic to the people who were offended by the band name. Like I agree with them probably fundamentally in politics and in, you know, social thinking. I agree with them. I'm sympathetic to them. And I can only apologize for the insult of having to suffer my petulant, childish, you know, indulgence there.
So I've heard you say after Rapeman that you didn't want to start a band that only stayed together a couple of years. Like you wanted to start a band that stayed together pretty much indefinitely.
Yeah.
Like how did you get together with Todd and Bob?
Well, Todd and I had known each other since the early 80s, and we played together in a couple of other bands. Like our friend Pete Conway put records out under the name Flower. And when he toured his backing band, I was in his backing band with Todd. And we enjoyed playing together. And then while we were working on Peter's stuff, on the Flower music, Todd and I also would play together on our own with music that eventually became Shellac. And then we worked on that kind of informally for a couple of years. Like every few weeks, one or the other of us would fly to or drive to, you know, like I would drive to Minneapolis or Todd would drive down from Minneapolis to Chicago, and we would play and rehearse and write songs informally over the course of a couple of years. And eventually we formed a band. When Bob Weston moved to Chicago, it was partly with the idea that he could play bass in our band, and partly with the idea that he could work at the studio that I was building, and partly with the idea that it was just a good change of pace for him, change of scenery for him to get away from Boston. he had lived in Boston or near Boston his whole life. And he'd only really seen the world while he was touring. So he thought it would be a good idea to move away from home and live someplace else for a while. And so that all of those things conspired to bring him to Chicago. And the moment that he joined the band, it seemed complete, and that's when we started recording and started touring.
Right. So was the debut album at Action Park, was that engineered by Ian Burgess?
No, it was pretty much me and Bob doing the actual engineering, but Ian was around and Peter Deimel was around. Peter Deimel, who's his partner at Black Box. Both of them were there, and they had opinions and stuff, but we were doing all of the heavy lifting.
Has that been the case with like all of the Shellac albums that you and Bob
pretty much
engineered them?
Yeah, pretty much it's me and Bob doing the engineering. Like, obviously when we're playing, we can't also be in the control room running the tape machine, so we deputize someone to operate the tape machines and stuff while we're actually playing. But for the most part, it's between Bob and myself, we can cover all of the engineering.
Nice. I can see that you recorded your second album, Terraform, in 95 and 96, but it wasn't released until 98. Do you remember why that was?
We just take a long time to get things done. Like, we don't spend a lot of time in the studio. Like, we might only spend 3 or 4 days in total, or in total time in the studio to make an album. But those 3 or 4 days can be spread out over 5 or 6 years, Like, one weekend, we do a weekend, and then we talk about it for 6 months, and then we do another weekend, and then we talk about it for a year, and then we do another weekend to finish everything up. But then there are some details that take another year to resolve. Like, we all have very busy schedules, and it's difficult to find time to work on the band. And so, depending on how busy we are in our regular lives, years can go by. Some of the songs for the album that's about to be in the stores, some of the songs for that album we have been playing for 8 or 9 years now, but they have never been released. So
you talked about how you handle your relationship with Shellac, like you approach it like a hobby that you take super seriously.
Yeah.
Like, you don't rely on it for paying the rent, so you end up enjoying it much more.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. I can't help to link it because I saw you guys play here in Iceland in 2014 at All Tomorrow's Parties.
Yeah.
And it's seriously one of the best gigs I've ever seen. And I've seen a lot of gigs where the band was phoning it in, and that was really not the case with that concert. Like, you could feel that the band was having a blast playing that show by themselves,
Yeah, I mean, it's the best thing that I ever get to do, and the hour on stage is the best hour of my life. It's a pure joy for us. And one of the reasons I think that it remains so valuable to us is that we don't treat it like a job. It's not an obligation for us. It's something that we get to do as a pure, as a very pure experience of creation. And so it's not that, there's nothing about it that is an obligation or just a pro forma exercise. Like, whenever we're playing, it's like, it's the best feeling to be playing with Bob and Todd, honestly.
Right. And also because you don't rely on it, you're not spent from touring,
Exactly. If we relied on it, we would have to play a lot more, and eventually that would turn into fatigue or resentment on our part. Like, if you absolutely must be on tour 10 months out of the year in order to make a living, well, then at the end of that 9th month, you're going to be very angry that that's your situation in life, and you're going to wish that you didn't have to do it. But for us, it's instead of being 10 months out of the year that we're touring, it's at most it's 9 or 10 weeks. And so we have a full and complete life the rest of the year. And then when we're touring, we can devote ourselves completely to that project in the moment without it being an obligation or a chore.
I was wondering how the underground music culture has changed since back in the days. I mean, you guys, you still book your own shows and haul your own gear, right?
Yeah, we still do everything ourselves. That still seems like the best way to do things.
Right. But are there any other differences since back in the days with Big Black?
Yeah, a lot of things are different. Like the internet has made a huge change in terms of like just ability to contact people and getting answers to questions quickly. The distribution of music has changed. Like we used to make and sell records, and the principal income for the band was from selling records. And now, we do still sell records, and I'm grateful for that. But the principal income for the band is from touring, and I'm sure that's true for most functioning bands. So yeah, everything has changed, but the mentality, the fundamental behavior and the spirit that we conduct ourselves, that's all the same.
So, did you see a big drop in revenues after you pulled your stuff from Spotify?
No, we never made very much money. I mean, bands like us don't make very much money from streaming. A little bit, but not enough that it matters.
But you talked about that you get more royalties than some of the bands who are much bigger because they have like contracts with large corporations who are siphoning the money.
Yeah, but that's all related to the sales of the records. That's not related to streaming income. Streaming income is bullshit. Very, very few people make anything off of streaming. Streaming income is the biggest scam. Because the money comes from subscriptions and advertising, and it goes into the corporate tier, but it doesn't filter its way down to the artists very much at all.
You built the electrical audio building in 1995, right?
It started in 95 and the studio opened in 97. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how the building is constructed?
The building exterior is from the early 20th century, 1905, I believe. And it's a brick building that was originally a dairy barn. And then some years later, a second floor was added, and it became a printing company. When we got the building, we emptied out the entire inside of the building, and we built all of our studio inside. And the walls of the studio rooms are built of adobe, which is an unfired earth brick. And we chose that for the acoustic property of it being very heavy and very dense, but also very soft. So it sort of self-isolates the walls, and it prevents the sound transmission across the wall. So we're very isolated from the rest of the city in terms of the noise of the outside world doesn't make its way into the studio. And then also the noise that we make inside the studio doesn't make its way out into the world.
Do you think if you didn't have your creative outlet with Shellac that you might start to feel more inclined to like take part in the process of the records you're making?
I mean, I feel like my perspective on that is so firmly set now that it would feel really unnatural for me to start offering opinions and trying to convince people to do things my way. It would feel very alien, and I don't think I could behave that way.
Okay. I mean, that's basically what you did when you recorded in Utero. Like, you had a band and they were super well rehearsed and had a natural chemistry, and you got them basically to play live together, in a room and capture that magic undiluted.
I mean, that's a kind of a good description of my job is, to make a recording of a band at their best. And if I do my part correctly, then I'm not interfering with them doing their part correctly, you know?
Yeah. And it's, kind of up to the band to show up with good material to make a good record.
Yeah, but also I feel like there is another aspect to it, which is that the band is a part of the life experience of the people in the band. And I want them to have an enjoyable experience making the record. I don't want them to feel like someone is being critical of them or like someone is bossing them around. I want them to be able to have, a completely free, expressive experience.
And you indulge people in weird things at the studio if you think it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to my the idea that the band should be able to have the kind of experience they want. And if what they want to do is do some crazy stuff in the studio, then we get to do some crazy stuff in the studio. That's fine. Sometimes it's not realistic. If you have a condensed schedule, if you only have a few days to make an album and someone wants to do something really outlandish, if that's going to consume too much time and make it so that you don't finish the record, well, then it's not reasonable. But anything reasonable, I'm happy to try.
So after In Utero was released, like you saw your clientele drop and you basically went broke, right?
Yeah, there was a big industry fallout after that record was after the record was turned in, but before it was released, there was a kind of a panic in the big record labels about the way Nirvana made that record sort of prevented the record label from having any influence on it. They just went off on their own and made a record and then came home and said, here's our record. It's finished, right?
Right.
If that was allowed to be the standard method for making records, if that became a normal thing, then record labels would lose a lot of their influence and a lot of their control over their signed bands. And that was seen as a very dangerous precedent. And so there was an active effort to try to suppress that record and to try to make it uncomfortable for people to make records in that way. And I got caught in the crossfire. And I think, prior to that album, I had been doing 3 or 4 major label records per year. And then after that record, I think I did 2 more major label records in like lifetime.
Right. So how did you rebuild your clientele?
Well, the main bread and butter clientele was always the underground and independent bands.
And they didn't shun you after you worked with Nirvana?
There was a brief period where people were kind of suspicious of me because they had seen other people get involved with big record labels and then become unavailable. But as soon as it was clear that that wasn't happening, then my normal clientele came back.
So when In Utero got the 20th anniversary release, you were asked to remix the album.
Yeah.
Did you go back and give it a listen and actually see if you had anything to offer, or how was your initial reaction?
Well, the argument for remixing it was not to try to improve things, but the argument was that there were options and choices made during the session that they could have made a different decision. Like, okay, we used all of the strings on this song. Maybe we should get rid of some of the strings. Okay, we used this guitar solo on the song. Maybe we should have used the other guitar solo. On this song, there was a harmony vocal. What does it sound like without the harmony vocal? Like all of those were the kinds of decisions that they wanted to make a version of the record that explored some of these options. No one involved thinks that the remix 2013 version is the masterpiece pinnacle version. Everyone recognizes that the original version of the record is the real one. This alternate version was intended to be a complement to that original one and not not intended to be like an improvement.
Okay, just like from a different angle.
Exactly.
So you were involved also in the process of remastering the original album.
Yeah, that was very satisfying. Yeah.
And you've talked about that, like the end result was the absolute best, best sounding record you could ever make.
Yeah.
Can you take us through the steps?
So in record mastering, there are a number of compromises that you have to make. If the record is long in duration, like if it's a 45 or 50-minute album, then to fit it on a single disc for an LP, you have to compromise the sound quality. You have to narrow the stereo image. You have to cut the bass frequencies. You have to drop the level. You have to make all of these compromises in the sound quality. There is a technology that allows you to do less compromise, which is to cut it into copper rather than into lacquer. And that's called direct metal mastering. And if you do that, then you have less compromise in the sound quality for the same duration on a single disc. You can also improve matters by, instead of using a single disc at 33 RPM, if you use two discs at 45 RPM, more of the disc to play with, you have more physical space on the disc, you have more groove time. So you need even less compromise in order to get everything satisfactory in that setting, in the double 12-inch 45. So when the label said that they agreed to do a deluxe edition, which was a double 12-inch 45 with direct metal mastering from the original master tapes, I mean, that is, by definition, that's the best that you can get. You really cannot make a better, cleaner transfer than doing things in that way. And I was able to oversee the whole thing at Abbey Road, and working with an engineer named Steve Rook, who's a longtime associate of mine, and he's retired now, but I think he was the ideal person to work on that project. And I was extremely happy with the way all of that came out.
I mean, I guess bands tend not to do that kind of release. I've seen those releases once in a while, these 45 releases, but I guess they're much more expensive to produce.
Yeah, it's more expensive. You have to pay for two discs rather than one. The mastering session is more complicated because you have to cut two lacquers rather than one, or two discs rather than one. The investment of time and the materials it's not double, but it's more. And then when you press the records, you have to have a special sleeve made for a double record, and you have to pay for two discs. And so it can more than double the cost to the record label to do a record that way. But you can't necessarily sell the record for 2 times the list price of a single record. Sometimes you can. I mean, people are now quite flexible about what they're willing to pay for a record, and I think that's a good development. But, anybody is going to be slightly, concerned when a record is 50 euros or something. That's going to be a kind of a shock to people. And then if it's not successful, like you do it as an experiment and it doesn't work, and then you're left with all of this inventory that's crazy expensive. So it's a big risk to do things that way, and I understand why people don't do it. But it is, in terms of sound quality, that is by far, that's the best sound quality.
When you say the label approved it, that's not the same people who tried to fuck you over in the 90s, right?
No, I think in some sort of sense of continuity, it's the same label, but the actual people were different people. Yeah.
So that's a great talk you gave in Melbourne, Australia in 2014, where you were giving a talk on the state of the music business.
Yeah.
And basically how the collapse of the old business model has left the bands and the audience to work out their relationship, and how there's essentially more chance to get your music distributed because of the internet and heard versus in the old days, and just as much chance of bands making money from their art?
Yeah.
Because it's been 10 years now since that talk. Do you think things have changed?
Well, the thing that has happened now is that the streaming companies have begun to exert more control over access. And so when someone posts something up on YouTube, it's now very quickly flagged and removed. But there are still informal methods for things to be distributed, and I think things like Bandcamp, although Bandcamp was recently sold, and I think that that's a dangerous
really?
situation there. But Bandcamp was a really great resource. It allowed to communicate with their audiences very directly. They could sell their merchandise. They could set a price for their streaming or downloading. All of those things were great. Don't know how much of that is going to survive under the new management, but yeah, I think we are inching toward a future where basically everything is going to be available for free all the time, and everybody is eventually going to come to that realization, and then it will just happen automatically.
It does seem that vinyl records are making a comeback. I think in 2022 they outsold CDs for the first time since 1987. So it seems like more young people are getting into more, more mindfulness way of listening to music, maybe.
Well, I think what has always been true is that people who want to have a personal collection of music, they collect LPs or vinyl records. So music collectors will have a room full of LPs and 7-inch singles that is their music collection. People who want to listen to music casually will use casual methods like the CD and then the iPod and now streaming. Those are casual methods for listening to music, and people who are not collecting music but are just listening for the moment are going to use those casual methods. But it's always been true that the serious music collectors, people who want to have a personal library of music, are going to buy vinyl records. And that, I think that will be true for my lifetime.
So you don't see an increase in the amount of LPs that you guys are selling?
Our LP sales have been remarkably consistent. Like when we put out a record, there's a big splurge, there's an initial excitement about new record coming out, and we sell 10 or 20,000 right away. And then over time, the sales continue a little bit every month. And it takes years to sell the same amount that you sold in the first month,
And that's the same for the big black Rapeman back catalog.
Yeah, everything still sells, but it doesn't sell a lot. But it's always been, it's a consistent amount of sales, and it hasn't really changed that much over the years.
Okay.
Hey, I have to get going quickly. So
yeah, sure. Let's wrap it up. I remember this quote where you said you wore earplugs extensively.
Yeah.
To protect your hearing, and you've talked about that you want to stop making records before your hearing goes out.
Yeah.
Do you see yourself touring with Shellac after you stop making records? Do you think there's less pressure to have a good hearing to do that job well as opposed to making records?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't thought about it. We don't really make long-term plans with Shellac. We just carry on. When the band started, Bob asked me, like, how long do you think we could do this? And I said, well, the first 100 years, I can promise you. And after that, we'll have to negotiate. So
do you see yourself still making music for yourself after you stop doing it commercially?
I don't know when I'm going to have to retire. I suspect that I'm going to have to retire sometime in the next 10 years. When I do, I think I will probably still want to play in the band. I don't know. I'll let you know when I wake up one morning and I don't want to be an engineer anymore. But for the moment, I'm quite happy being in Shellac.
Well, thank you so much for all of your work, Steve, and thank you for doing this. Thank you for taking the time. I really do appreciate it.
Hey, no problem.
All the best, man.
Thanks for asking me. Bye-bye.